Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this webinar dealing with the latest addition to the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness. I can see we've already got a lot of people on the session, but I'm conscious we've got a few more joining as I'm starting to talk. So I'll do the introduction and we'll give everybody a chance to get logged on and join us before we get into sort of the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. As you're all well aware by now, the latest edition of DVSA's Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness finally landed with us on bonfire night, perhaps not quite causing the fireworks that we perhaps anticipated, given the length of time that we were forewarned that this document was coming. But that said, there are still some very significant changes in there, some more subtle than others, and some that will impact some of you to a greater or lesser extent than others. So what I've done is gone through the old guide and the new guide. I've compared what's changed and where and how that's going to impact you, and hopefully I can shed some light on what you might need to change now in relation to your systems and procedures going forward. Now, in terms of the guide, let's just remind ourselves of the position with the guide and where that sits in terms of your obligations. Well, the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness is, as the name says on the tin, a guide. But we all know from experience dealing with DVSA and the traffic commissioners that it's given a far greater significance and weight than simply being guidance. It is the standard against which you're going to be assessed should you find yourself subject to a DVSA investigation or a public inquiry before the traffic commissioner. And it's been repeatedly confirmed that it does set out what best practice should look like, and that if you depart from what that guidance says, you need to demonstrate that any alternative method of achieving that particular area of compliance actually does achieve compliance. So it's quite a high bar to satisfy if you are going to depart from the guide. Now, the guide itself, in terms of changes, first of all, it doesn't look any different. A lot of you will be looking at the screen now and thinking, well, that's exactly the same as the old version that was issued back in about April 2023. And you'd be right, it's the same colour, it's the same picture. The only thing that they've changed is they've added a sentence to say that it outlines the regulatory requirements and industry best practice. And they've also helpfully added October 2024 towards the bottom of the front cover, so you can identify that it is the latest edition. Now, I would suggest that you only access the guide via the official link on gov.uk. Some of you may have previous copies of the guide shared locally on your devices or hard copies that you've printed out. Do make sure you revert to the online gov.uk version each time you're looking at that and consulting it to check what you need to be doing in practice, because that is going to be the official and latest guidance no matter when you check that. So don't rely on something you might have downloaded or obtained via a different website. I will be sending out after the session to all of you that have registered a useful links document, and one of the links that will be in there will be the link to the guide itself. There'll be other links to various other documents and items that I talk about as we go through the session included in there, and obviously you'll all get a certificate to confirm that you've attended today's session. I have had some questions in already, actually, so just while on that point, I'll remind you all there is a question and answers box at the top of your screen. Do feel free to ask questions as we go through, or share your thoughts on or provide comments on what we're talking about or any other observations you have from what I might be saying or what you've seen for yourselves in the guide. The questions are all anonymous. I will see them, but nobody else will know who's asked what. And as always, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So do feel free to ask or make any comments that you see fit. Now, in terms of changes, helpfully in this guide, they've actually included inside the front cover a change table. And this lists 7 different areas of the guide that they are sort of headlining as being where updates to the guide have been made. But don't be lulled into sort of a false sense of security that they are the only changes. There are far more changes in the detail in various other sections of the guide, and I will take you through those. But just to give you a flavour, there are actually 279 changes in total. So those 7 areas don't go anywhere near far enough in telling you everything you need to know about what has changed and what's in place as of the 5th of November. Having said that, some of those 279 changes are obviously things like paragraph numbers changing or page numbers changing, things like capitalising traffic commissioner instead of it being lowercase, and changing the words of inspector to examiner when they're talking about DVSA personnel. But there are some far more significant changes through the session. Now, the 7 bullet points on the screen replicate the 7 areas that they've referred to in the change table. So what they perhaps suggest are the key changes that you need to be mindful of. And perhaps unsurprisingly, brake testing is one of those featured in 4 actually of the 7 bullet points. So I will be spending a little bit of time talking about brake testing. I'm also going to talk to you about your safety inspection and repair facilities and build really on what's been said already in previous versions of the guide, because whilst there is some change in the detail, the underlying principle when it comes to your safety inspection and repair arrangements hasn't changed. That's not new. What I would say is, whilst I'm taking you through this to try and make your lives easier, unfortunately, this is not a substitute for you actually reading the guide and looking at it yourself. So I'm sorry, but you all are going to have some homework to do. You do need to be familiar with the detail, because ultimately it's you that's going to be the one in front of a DVSA examiner or a traffic commissioner if something is investigated or something does go wrong. So you need to be intimately familiar with the detail of the guide. You're expected to know there's case law to say that it's in the public domain, so you're taken to know its content even if you've never looked at it. So don't give them that easy win by not looking at it for yourselves. Okay, so is it just a guide? I've already explained that the answer to this in short is no, but going into a little bit more detail, the guide, it's badged up as being DVSA's guide. Well, that's only in part true. DVSA prepare the guide in conjunction with a lot of different industry stakeholders, including the trade associations, the traffic commissioners, and various others who have an interest in essentially the safe and now sustainable operation of vehicles. So it is very much considered to be best practice for both existing and experienced operators, as well as new operators coming into the market. It's not law, but it has a more significant status than simply a guide. The upper tribunal on appeal from traffic commissioner decisions has repeatedly confirmed that the guidance is to be relied on as setting out what the standards are when it comes to maintenance systems and their expectations. And as I said earlier, if you're not doing something in the way the guide suggests, the burden very much lies with you to demonstrate that your alternative way of doing something actually achieves compliance. And it's a pretty high bar to meet. The 2 key things in terms of phraseology in the guide for you to note, which haven't changed from last time, but it's worth providing you with a reminder because this was something that was introduced new last April, is they've sort of adopted the approach of the Highway Code using phrases that refer to must obligations and should obligations. Now, must obligations relate to things that are a direct legal obligation. So if you don't comply with them, you don't do what that command is telling you to, you are breaching some regulation or law, and potentially there'll be other consequences than simply traffic commissioner action that might flow from that, in, for example, the criminal courts. On the other hand, we've got a series of obligations where they are saying you should do something. Now, these aren't law, they're not flowing from a direct legal obligation in any of the relevant legislation, but they are very much considered by all of those stakeholders that had a role in developing the guide to be best practice, and therefore it's strongly recommended that you do things in the way that the guide says you should. And as I said earlier, if you can demonstrate an alternative approach still achieves compliance, so be it. But very often in the main, the situation is that if you're not following what the guide suggests, even as a should, you are going to be open to criticism by both DVSA and the traffic commissioners. And this is the standard that you are going to be assessed against should you find yourself subject to a desk-based assessment, a maintenance investigation, or preliminary hearing or public inquiry. Now, getting into some of the detail, I'm going to work through essentially that change table first, and then look at some of the more perhaps subtle changes that certainly I've not seen anybody else commenting on yet, but they're definitely there in the detail. First of all, if we start with your safety inspection and repair facilities. Now, those of you that are members of any of the relevant trade associations will have no doubt been party to some of the discussions or seen some of their publications talking over the last year or so about holding maintenance providers accountable and whether there should be some sort of role for the traffic commissioners in regulating, for example, main dealer garages or other external garages that you might engage to conduct your maintenance. Well, the guide introduces some further detail in that regard. It doesn't go so far as to say maintenance providers are now going to be subject to action, for example, but it does provide you, hopefully, with some useful tools and guidance to help you manage your maintenance obligations with external contractors in particular. The starting point, which has always been the position, is that you as the operator or transport manager carry the can for any maintenance obligations or maintenance failings. And that applies even if it's the maintenance provider that's let you down. You have an obligation to manage them. And it's you that the traffic commissioner or DVSA will criticise and potentially take action against if the maintenance provider isn't delivering maintenance to the standard required. And that standard isn't just in terms of the physical inspection of the vehicles. As we know, there's a high level of scrutiny over the maintenance documentation, the audit trail, and the completion and particularly transport management audit of that record keeping element. So regardless of whether it's physical maintenance activity or the record keeping obligations that flow from the maintenance activity, you are responsible for managing the contractor. And what the new guide does is build on that by reminding you that it's your obligation to manage your maintenance provision, whether you choose to do that through in-house maintenance or external maintenance contractors. And that if you choose to outsource any of your maintenance, you need to take steps to ensure the facilities, the equipment, and the staff are satisfactory and that the work is being completed to a satisfactory standard. So you essentially have to introduce systems to quality control, to audit your maintenance provider. Now, I personally don't think that's new. I think they are just making it abundantly clear by including the paragraph that you can see on the screen in page 45 of the guide. It's always been recommended as best practice. Certainly, it was set out clearly in the last edition of the guide that you were to ensure the maintenance provider had satisfactory facilities and equipment. The guide includes a list that you can use to check what your provider has available against what the guide says. And there's always been an emphasis on staff and their accreditation or their training and competence when it comes to the maintenance of large vehicles. What the guide does now is go slightly further than that and actually now talks about workshop accreditation as opposed to simply individual technicians being accredited through one of the various different schemes that are available. Now, ERTEC is the scheme that was referred to in the previous guide. That's still referred to both in the context of the individual technicians and also the maintenance provision, their facility and their equipment. But in addition, they talk about manufacturers, main dealers approved accreditation schemes. They talk about other industry accreditation schemes for the actual workshop facility. So you need to be thinking about how you are going to build these sorts of quality checks into, firstly, your processes when you're choosing a maintenance provider at the outset, but also on an ongoing basis, satisfying yourself that the facilities and equipment are appropriate and meet what the guide suggests should be there as a minimum, and that importantly, the staff that are actually carrying out the work on your vehicles are suitably trained, qualified and competent to do that. Simple things you can think about introducing are using the maintenance supplier assessment tool that's been around for a number of years now. It's produced by the SOE and the IRTE. It's essentially an audit document that you can use yourselves to assess all those different elements of your maintenance providers, facilities, equipment and staff. Ask those questions. And if you're not comfortable doing that yourself, engage an independent third party to perhaps do that for you. Because the obligation clearly under the latest guide is on you to have some sort of quality check process of your maintenance provider. It's not simply enough for you to say, oh, they're a main dealer, everybody else in the area uses them and so on, particularly if there are shortcomings identified in your maintenance regime through, say, an investigation, MOT fails or prohibitions being issued. Also, think about asking them about their own MOT pass rates. If they are maintaining numerous fleets for numerous operators, what percentage of those vehicles are actually passing on initial presentation for MOT? If they aren't achieving at least the national average pass rate across all of those fleets, they're not going to achieve that for your vehicles, and that's going to put you in difficulty because, as we all know, the MOT is one of those key metrics that feeds into your OCRS and is of interest to both DVSA and the traffic commissioners. Now, the other side of this is the introduction of a pilot scheme for actually rating maintenance provision. And it's the maintenance provision rating scheme that I've referred to on the screen. This was introduced on a pilot basis in July this year, and the pilot's intended to run to, I think, mid next year, and they're then going to look at rolling it out more mainstream. You can, in the guide, click on a link to another website. It takes you through directly to the IRTE website where there's more information about the pilot of the MPRS scheme. And the pilot's open to join. There's a button on there you can click through and apply to join the pilot if, for example, your internal workshop wants to be part of the rating scheme. And ultimately, the idea with that is that there'll be an independent rating system for maintenance providers that gives them a categorization, I suppose, as either good, bad, brilliant, medium, and whatever. There'll be a tiering, and you can use that as a point of reference when choosing a maintenance provider. I would urge you to, well, I would issue a word of caution on that, really. The rating scheme will be based on things like audits of the maintenance provision. It will be a snapshot at that point that they are given that rating. Don't blindly rely on the rating that a maintenance provider has. You need to actually be satisfied that what they're doing for your vehicles in reality is achieving the standards expected. If you're having issues, you're having MOT fails, you're getting prohibitions for issues that they should have detected at safety inspection, you're not going to be able to use the explanation, oh, well, they're rated as a good provider, to avoid the traffic commissioner or the DVSA taking issue with your maintenance arrangements. So don't just blindly accept that they are rated and therefore they will be good. I think over the years, a lot of us have realised that relying on the fact that, for example, someone's associated with a main dealer doesn't always mean, and don't get me wrong, there are some very good main dealer maintenance providers out there, but there are also some that aren't so good. Just the fact that they're associated with a main dealer does not necessarily mean they are going to be maintaining to the standard or providing the documentation to the standard that's required. So you still need to have your own quality control checks and processes in place to make sure that you are not exposed in some way because of your maintenance provider. Also, think about the maintenance contract itself, both regardless, of whether they are part of the maintenance provision rating scheme or not. Think about your maintenance contract and the terms and conditions that you can perhaps seek to incorporate into that contract that help you and assist you to fulfil your obligations to the Traffic Commissioner about your maintenance and the standard of the maintenance. There is an example maintenance contract included in one of the annexes to the guide. That's not new and it hasn't changed or been updated this time round, but it was significantly updated last time. Think about including in that things like the facilities you require them to have available, the equipment you require them to have available, for example, a roller brake tester, and also terms relating to the provision of the documentation relating to maintenance activity. When do you get that from them? How quickly are they providing it? And what recourse do you have if they're not completing it correctly or not providing it at all? Okay, moving on then to brake performance. Brake performance is probably the single biggest section in the guide that that has been updated. The guide itself is now divided into various different sections for brake testing. So we have brake testing now, and we also have brake performance post April 2025. And I'll come on to that April 2025 piece in a moment. What I would say is I actually think there's been a huge climb down in terms of the brake testing expectations compared with what we were led to believe was coming. So the previous guide indicated what we were to anticipate from April 2025. And as you'll see in a few moments, the guide now in issue doesn't go as far as what we were expecting it to. Dealing firstly, though, with the position now, essentially the guide reiterates what has been the current and known and accepted position in terms of brake testing for quite some time. It starts with the requirement that every safety inspection must include an assessment of the brake performance of the vehicle or trailer. That's not new. It goes on to talk about the different ways in which you can achieve that measured brake performance assessment. And it starts with EBPMS. So if you have fleet fitted with electronic braking performance monitoring systems, then the reports that are produced from that will be sufficient to satisfy the fact that a brake test has been carried out in connection with the safety inspection. You do need to look at the detail of the electronic brake performance monitoring section in the guide because it sets out clearly what's expected of the system and what that system should be providing by way of tangible documentation for you to annex to the safety inspection record. But EBPMS is the starting point for the current position in terms of what they consider to be an acceptable means of brake performance assessment. After that, what they say is if there's no EBPMS fitted, a calibrated roller brake tester should be used to assess overall and individual braking efficiencies. And that's the starting point when it comes to the traffic commissioners and DVSA. The expectation is and has been now for at least the last year that you will be laden roller brake testing your vehicles. And many of you will have been involved in processes perhaps with DVSA or the traffic commissioners where they are critical of you if you are not having that roller brake test at every safety inspection. And they've very much been encouraging operators, often through the use of undertakings, to commit to that regime. The third limb, or the third acceptable method, sort of a step down again, is that where you're not having a roller brake test, you could use an approved and calibrated decelerometer. Now, the position pre this guide was that if you had a decelerometer test, you had to accompany that with temperature tests of the individual wheels to see if the brakes on those individual axles were working. What they've done in this guide is expanded the section dealing with temperature testing to say that a temperature check needs to be carried out both before and after the decelerometer test to help identify if the individual brakes are operational, the final brake temperature readings need to be significantly higher than the initial readings to properly assess the brake performance, with relatively consistent readings taken for each brake across an axle. Where you cannot achieve satisfactory results through the temperature testing and the decelerometer testing, you will need to use an alternative method of brake testing to satisfy the requirement for a brake test at that safety inspection. So previously the position just referred to a temperature test. Now it's far more prescriptive. There needs to be one both before and after, and those readings need to be recorded. And you need to be looking at those readings intelligently to determine whether actually the brakes are operational on each of the individual axles in the way that the guide describes. Now, the position we anticipated was coming from April 2025 was that the expectation would be that only either EBPMS or a laden roller brake test at every safety inspection would be acceptable. We were expected to see decelerometer testing go, and we certainly expected that minimum 4 times a year for laden roller brake testing will be replaced by the every PMI laden roller brake test requirements. And that is certainly what we've seen the traffic commissioners gearing up to over the last year in public inquiries. So I'm going to go on to talk about what April 2025 will look like now, but just bear in mind as I'm going through this, if you do have any undertakings on your licence relating to brake testing, now is a really good time to revisit those, to check exactly what you have committed to, and to make sure that you are not over-committing yourself in that undertaking, because any failure to fulfil the terms of that undertaking will be a breach, regardless of what the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness says, because those undertakings are specific promises you have given to the Traffic Commissioner. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So brake performance assessment from April 2025. What do we now have? Well, as I've already said, this is, in my view, a real climb down from what we were expecting and what we were led to believe from the previous guide was coming for April 2025. Now, what they say is repeat that every safety inspection will include a brake performance assessment, but they then go on to say that that will be using either a roller brake test, a suitable EBPMS, or a decelerometer with temperature readings. So actually, they've retained the flexibility in terms of options for brake testing that exists already in terms of those 3 different methods. They've also pedaled back from the expectation that it would be a laden roller brake test every time. What the guide says is that from April 2025, if there's no EBPMS, the expectation will be that there's a laden roller brake test a minimum of 4 times a year, that they will be spread evenly through the year, and that they can include the annual test as one of those 4. So quite a relaxation, in my view, from the position that was mooted as coming from April 2025 in the previous guide. What they go on to introduce is the requirement for, well, a more prescriptive requirement for a risk assessment. The previous guide already referred to risk assessments for brake testing, and the expectation that if you were doing roller brake testing unladen, you would risk assess the appropriateness of that decision. Now, the guide firstly reiterates that if you are not doing a roller brake test laden, you must do a risk assessment to explain why that decision is appropriate. And secondly, they actually include an example risk assessment template for you to use in the rear of the guide in the annexes. And I'll look at that with you in a moment. In terms of the risk assessment itself, what they are saying is that this must be completed by a competent person. And that competent person, there is some narrative as a footnote in the guide as to what they're looking at there. Competent person, they talk about somebody having the relevant training, skills, qualifications to make that decision. So for me, that competent person should be somebody with an engineering capability, engineering qualifications and skills, who's capable and competent to say that actually not laden roller brake testing this vehicle is perfectly safe for these reasons on this occasion. And we'll have a look at that risk assessment a little bit more in a moment. But that conversation and decision around that unladen roller brake test piece does need to be from somebody who has that knowledge, skills and qualifications to do so. It can be done in conjunction with you as transport manager, you as operator, but it certainly needs to involve somebody with engineering expertise. What they've also done in the guide through the revisions is actually extended the period in which you can get the brake test done for the purposes of a safety inspection. Now, last iteration of the guide, we saw the introduction of a reference to no more than 7 days before the date of the PMI. And that replaced what had previously been said, which was within a week. And that within a week was taken as being, it could be up to a week before or up to a week after the safety inspection. The last guide made it clear that that meant up to a week before, and that the brake test paperwork had to be given to whoever was carrying out the safety inspection so that they could be satisfied that brake test had been completed, and that therefore they could declare the vehicle roadworthy and sign that declaration at the bottom of the PMI record. Now, what this guide does is extend that 7-day period up to 14. So actually, you've got up to 2 weeks before your safety inspection to get the brake test done that counts towards that safety inspection's brake test. So they've introduced that presumably in recognition of the fact that there are a lot of vehicles that can't simply run into a brake tester, a rolling road brake test laden with their normal type of load, that safety inspections cannot be carried out with the vehicle loaded for health and safety reasons and so on. But they've introduced that 14-day period, which gives you far greater flexibility. A word of caution on that though, 14 days is quite a long time, particularly if you're an operator on a 4-week safety inspection interval. It's half your interval. A lot can happen in that 2 weeks that may affect the brakes. So certainly if something happens in that intervening period where there are concerns about brake performance, or there's actually work carried out at the safety inspection itself that affects the brakes or interferes with the brakes in some way, you will need to redo that brake test for the purposes of the safety inspection and for the purposes of signing that vehicle back as being roadworthy. So it's not simply a case of do it 14 days before or at some point in that 14-day period, and that goes on the file with the safety inspection record. It needs to be a live consideration as you go through that 2-week period up to the safety inspection itself. Similarly, if you're using any other method of brake performance assessment, whether it's a decelerometer, whether it's EBPMS, if there are concerns around brake performance or there's work done that interferes with the braking components and system, you will need to again have another brake test so that you can satisfy yourself the brakes are in fact in fit and efficient working order. So moving on to the risk assessment, the risk assessment template, I've actually included the annex from the guide on the screen for you. So you should be able to see that and all of the detail that it covers, which I'll go through in a moment. What they say in the guide is that you must have a risk assessment available to support every safety inspection where you decide not to carry out a laden roller brake test or the vehicle is not fitted with EBPMS. So there needs to be a risk assessment available for each of those safety inspections, whether you're on a 4, 6, 8, 12 or whatever week interval it might be. My reading of the guide, that doesn't necessarily mean, certainly for all operators, you will have to do a risk assessment every safety inspection. The guide says that risk assessments must be reviewed every 12 months. And obviously, as with any risk assessment that you'll all be familiar with, if something changes in that 12-month period, you would revisit the risk assessment to make sure that it remains appropriate. You would also need to make sure that you have a different risk assessment for different types of vehicles, different types of load perhaps that you're carrying, different elements of your fleet. But ultimately, if you are, for example, a PSV operator who will never be carrying out roller brake testing where you are physically loading the vehicle, it's accepted that your vehicles, by their design, are typically heavy enough to achieve a laden roller brake test result without it physically being loaded. I don't believe from reading the guide you need a risk assessment every time you present every vehicle for safety inspection. I think from what the guide says, it will suffice for you to do one risk assessment for each of your different vehicle types, perhaps at the start, have one per vehicle, so you've got one in the vehicle file that explains the basis for you not laden roller brake testing, i.e. the vehicles are heavy enough by design. And that is available on the file so that it's there over that 12-month period, and you review it, as the guide suggests, as a minimum every 12 months, or if something changes. I believe that will suffice. And there'll be other types of vehicles, such as refuse collection vehicles, for example, where that position, I believe, will be acceptable. For other vehicles that you would normally be expected to roller brake test laden, you are going to have a competent person complete a risk assessment in connection with every safety inspection where there's no laden roller brake test or EBPMS is not fitted. And as I've already said, that should be a competent person completing that risk assessment. And there's various information that should be included in the detail of the risk assessment. The example in the guide provides a template. It doesn't mean you have to use it, but if you don't use it and you choose to make up your own risk assessment, you need to make sure it covers as a minimum the detail that's in the Annex 7, as well as the detail that's actually bullet pointed in the risk assessment section of the guide. So you can see from there, we've got things like the age and type of vehicle, we've got any recommendations of the vehicle manufacturer is specifically referred to as an item in the bullet point checklist that they expect you to take into account, the nature of the load, the equipment and fittings it's carrying, the operations it's likely to be engaged in, the terrain it's operating on, and the list goes on. One thing they also ask you to look at is the acceptable reasons for there being no laden roller brake test. And the guide actually includes a list that I'll take you through in a moment of acceptable reasons for not having a laden roller brake test. Now, it isn't an exhaustive list, but certainly things that will not be accepted, I would imagine, are things like it was too difficult to arrange for it to be loaded to go in, or we couldn't send it in with our usual load on and it was out in service. Operational or commercial reasons are not going to cut it, in my view, when it comes to dealing with this risk assessment. And you'll see that as we go through the specific examples in a moment that they have included in the guide. They've also supported that with a number of case examples. There are, I think it's 3 in particular that they've referred to that look at different types of vehicle, different types of load, and circumstances in which the position of having no laden roller brake test is actually acceptable. So whilst they refer to specific types of vehicle, that's not to say that the circumstances might not also be applicable to your operation. For example, they refer to a tipper operator who is operating work in and out of a quarry, arduous nature of the work, off-road terrain, and a safety inspection cycle of 4 weeks, because that's what's been considered appropriate, looking at the various elements of the guidance relating to safety inspection intervals. What the example uses is the scenario of the vehicle's passed its annual test. 4 weeks later, it's due its safety inspection, and the decision is made that because it passed a laid and roller brake test at MOT, because it's only been 4 weeks and it can still achieve that minimum of 4 laid and roller brake tests a year, evenly spread out throughout the year, on that occasion, they will not conduct a laid and roller brake test. It will be unladen. They also look at things like whether any issues are found with the braking components or braking system during the PMI. There aren't. And so on that occasion, it's deemed acceptable that there's an unladen roller brake test completed. 4 weeks later, the example says the same considerations are taken into account, looking at the mileage that the vehicle's travelled in that time, looking at the work that's been carried out, and again, any issues that might have been reported on things like defect reports or other ad hoc maintenance. And they're satisfied that the laden roller brake test from the MOT can still stand. We're 8 weeks on. We can still achieve that laden roller brake test as a minimum at quarterly. And they plan to do the next safety inspection with a laden roller brake test. It goes on to say this pattern can continue for the remainder of the safety inspections unless any issues are found with the braking system where brake performance may be affected. So personally, I think that scenario gives huge flexibility from the position that we imagined we would find ourselves in with this new guide being issued. Essentially, I know it's 4-week intervals, but the same principle in theory would apply to an operator on a 6-week interval, every other being a laden roller brake test with a risk assessment in between for that 6-weekly interval. Still allows you to achieve your quarterly laden roller brake test as a minimum, and your risk assessment supports the intermediate 6-weekly inspections and why they're being conducted unladen. As I say, there are a couple of other examples in there. One of the examples particularly deals with where you've got a mixed fleet. One element of your fleet doing, for example, general haulage, and the other doing a very lightly loaded, I think in the scenario it's a plastics contract, and the different systems and protocols and risk assessments you would need for each of those, given the different nature of the load, particularly bearing in mind the fact that the vehicles on the plastics contract are very rarely, if ever, going to actually be carrying loads at capacity in terms of weight, or even over that 65% threshold that they expect for a laden roller brake test. So do have a look at the examples in the guide. Also, bear in mind these risk assessments are going to form part of your regular maintenance records. So your risk assessments, although it's referring to reviewing them every 12 months, they will need to be available on your maintenance files for that 15-month minimum period that the undertaking on your operator's license requires. Let's move on and have a look at a couple of the acceptable reasons for not laden roller brake testing your vehicles. Some of these will be familiar. They replicate in large part the exempt categories of vehicle that are included in the heavy vehicle brake test guide. And this guide to maintaining roadworthiness, as with previous editions, does refer back to those other guidance. So the heavy vehicle brake test guide is still very much good practice, good guidance, and it's referred to. We've got here things like livestock carriers where other means of loading the vehicle to achieve that 65% are not possible. We've got things like ADR where there's dangerous loads and specialist facilities not available. And then at the top, we can see the reference to what I've just referred to in that example, vehicles where in normal operating conditions, they're only carrying light loads. So they're never getting up to that 65%, or in the main, not getting up to that 65% of maximum axle design weight. They can be acceptable reasons for not laden roller brake testing. And the specific example used there is car transporters. I know there's been a lot of discussion historically about car transporters and how you can achieve a laden roller brake test, particularly when the manufacturers specifically do not recommend that you try and apply some form of other load to the vehicle, because it can cause other safety issues in relation to the design and construction of that vehicle. The Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness now recognises those types of issue and those types of scenario. There's a few more. Furniture removal vehicles, only when designed and constructed as a furniture removal vehicle. So not if you're simply using a standard vehicle for the purposes of furniture removal. There must be that specific design and construction for removals element. PSVs and vehicles operating at 50% or more of permitted axle weights when unladen. So again, this relates back to what I was talking about earlier with your risk assessments. If you've got vehicles that are never ever going to be laden roller brake test because of their design or construction, then I do believe that you doing one risk assessment for that vehicle each year will be sufficient, unless something changes in that year that would alter the position. So in addition to PSVs, we've got things like fixed plant. We've got other types of vehicle where there's a fixed appliance on the vehicle. Your refuse collection vehicles would fall into this category as well. And then finally, there's a bit of a catch-all really, where the construction or weight prevents the use of an RBT. This might be things like some of your abnormal loads vehicles, your special types. I know there's been a lot of discussion historically around brake testing and roller brake testing for those types of vehicles. So do look at the list of acceptable reasons, and obviously when you're conducting your risk assessments, you will need to be referring to one or more of those, or something akin to those reasons that's specific to your operation when you are completing those risk assessments. Okay, moving on, the final part on brakes is electronic brake performance monitoring systems. They have actually added into this specific guidance on how to brake function when a trailer is fitted with EBPMS. I think this is something that's been the subject of quite a bit of discussion previously, that EBPMS park brake performance was an area of question. Well, the guide seeks to clarify what's acceptable and sets out 5 bullet points as to the process that should be used in those circumstances. Bear in mind with EBPMS, it doesn't replace the need for your roller brake test laden MOT. And I would suggest, as part of your MOT preparation, best practice would be that you have a laden roller brake test as part of that MOT preparation process, even if you've got EBPMS fitted, because you're going to be assessed on a laden roller brake test for the purposes of your MOT. The last thing you want is a fail for brake performance, because the roller brake test produces something different to what the EBPMS is telling you. Do make sure, if you are using EBPMS, that you are looking at the records, looking at the data in a similar way to how they expect you to deal with roller brake test printouts. Look at it intelligently to see what it's telling you about the brake performance and whether there are any other issues that you need to perhaps explore or investigate further. I do know there have been some issues or inconsistencies with EBPMS where the EBPMS system is telling operators one thing, but then you put the vehicle over a laden roller brake test and it's failing, for example, where the EBPMS has not highlighted any issues. So don't simply, again, blindly rely on the results that are coming out of the EBPMS. Make sure you fully understand the system, the data, and what it's telling you. And speak to the supplier if you need training on the system, or you need a better understanding of what that data is telling you, because you will be expected to know, and you will inevitably be expected to answer questions on it in the same way the traffic commissioners are looking at brake test printouts and expecting transport managers to understand the detail there. Okay, other changes then. We have had, as I said at the outset, a number of other changes that are referred to, and there's three key ones that I want to draw to your attention. Firstly, wheel security. There's only a very small section in the Guide to Maintaining Roadworthiness that actually deals with wheel security, which is perhaps quite surprising considering the significance of wheel security systems. Nothing's changed in terms of the expectations of you of talks, retalks, and documenting that process. But what they have included when they're talking about the actual process that you'll have in place for retalking and refitting road wheels is that you will check manufacturers' recommended procedures when identifying what your process is going to look like. So I would suggest that when you are introducing or when you're revisiting your wheel fitting, torque and retorque processes, you do look at the manufacturer's recommended process and ensure that you are not doing something that contradicts that and that you're incorporating their recommendations into your process. And importantly, that it's evidence that you can produce if investigated or called to a hearing to demonstrate that you've gone through that thought process and you've had consideration to the manufacturer's recommendations. Secondly, vehicle emissions. Vehicle emissions, previous guide, and I think actually the one before it, both referred to the need for you to have a system in place for monitoring the use of AdBlue and ensuring and satisfying yourself that those vehicles that should use AdBlue were in fact doing so. That hasn't changed. What they've done is introduced a single word, the word documented, into the new guide. So now they expect you to clearly have a documented system to demonstrate that you are monitoring the use of AdBlue. And that isn't simply a case of the fact that you're satisfied you're buying AdBlue in bulk and that your vehicles are drawing AdBlue. You need to be satisfied that each individual vehicle and have evidence to prove that each individual vehicle is in fact using AdBlue. And one of the recommended ways of doing this, which isn't new, it was there in the previous guide, is through your driver's defect reporting. Your drivers should be checking AdBlue levels as part of their walk round check, and they should be recording on those defect reports if they are topping up the AdBlue. So if your defect reports don't include that, and I have seen some recently that don't, make sure you are updating those to include AdBlue as an item to be checked, that the drivers have to indicate and record how much AdBlue they're drawing if they are topping up the AdBlue. And then finally, annual test results. So this has been updated to reflect the changes that we've already seen earlier this year, where past certificates are no longer printed by the test station. They're only available via the online system. If the vehicle fails, you will still be given the physical copies of the documentation, but you do need to make sure that you are incorporating into your systems a mechanism or a process whereby you are checking the results of your MOTs in real time, downloading the documentation, including that as part of your vehicle maintenance history. And again, obviously it's something that affects your OCRS. You need to be aware of any issues as and when they happen. PRSs, remember, count as a fail for your OCRS, so you need to know about them and investigate them at the time to prevent repetition and satisfy yourself that you've not got an area of weakness in your system. Okay, so having cantered through the detail of the changes, what do you actually need to do now as operators and transport managers to make sure that you are complying with your obligations? Well, there's 6 key things, I suppose, if we count the reference at the top. There's 6 key things I think you should be doing now. The first is what I say whenever a new version of the guide is introduced, and that's review and update your current systems and procedures. So work through the guide, work through what your maintenance systems currently look like, and take the appropriate steps to update those systems to reflect the changes we've talked about and how they apply to your business. don't wait until you're perhaps subject to a DVSA investigation, because it will be too late. You'll be assessed against the new guide. If DVSA tip up today, tomorrow, next week, next month, they might give you a little bit of leeway in the next couple of weeks, but they will certainly be expecting transport managers to be on with making any relevant changes to reflect the new guidance, particularly in that key area of brake testing and quality control of your maintenance providers. In terms of brake testing specifically, prepare for April 2025. Now, as I've said, we're not facing the situation we perhaps thought we would be when it comes to the brake testing expectations, but you still need to take steps to prepare to make sure you are meeting, at the very least, the bare minimum expectation, and that you've got the appropriate documentation in place to use. For example, if you are wanting to rely on risk assessments for conducting unladen roller brake tests at any of your safety inspections, do also think about exploring EBPMS as an alternative. We've certainly had clients that tell us that actually on a cost benefit analysis, EBPMS works out better for them than laden roller brake testing, for example. So have a look at what works best for you and your operation. The guide clearly anticipates there's no one size fits all solution. So have a look at what works for you, but do take steps now to prepare for April 2025. Do also bear in mind what I said earlier about if you've got any specific undertakings on your operator's license. We've certainly seen an increased drive from the traffic commissioners over the last year to gently nudge, shall we say, operators down the road of having a laden roller brake test at every safety inspection. And that has resulted in them being quite insistent sometimes on undertakings being attached to operators' licenses that require a laden roller brake test at every safety inspection. Now, if that applies to you, you are going to have to do that or seek to have the undertaking varied or removed. You can't simply do what the guide now allows you to do, because you will fall foul of the traffic commissioner and be found to be in breach of the specific undertaking you've given to them. So you need to make sure you are varying or having that removed. If that applies to you, do get in touch with us. We can help you with that. The traffic commissioners aren't going to simply allow you to get rid of that undertaking without better understanding what you are intending to do by way of brake testing, because obviously they attached the undertaking for a reason. They'll want to be satisfied about what your brake testing arrangements are going to look like. So it's not quite as simple as just writing to ask for it to be removed. Thirdly, do make sure you understand the records that you're getting from your brake testing, whether that's the EBPMS or roller brake testing or your decelerometer temperature test readings. Make sure you understand what those results are showing you. You're auditing them as transport manager, and you're following up with the maintenance provider where you have concerns or queries, and document the detail of those conversations so that you can demonstrate you are being continuous and effective. Do think about your inspection and repair facilities. What are you going to do to quality control them? Think about the things I talked about earlier when it comes to auditing them, the maintenance provider rating scheme. Are they a member? And if so, what does this mean in practice for you? Take steps now to look at that. There are various independent audits that you can engage through the various trade associations of not only the facilities, but also actually the quality of the work that's being completed by the maintenance provision. For example, they'll allow the maintenance provider to conduct PMI and carry out the rectification work, and then an independent engineer conducts their own safety inspection to see if your maintenance provider missed anything. Very useful tool to help you assess the quality of what you're actually paying for, and give you that comfort that you are satisfying your obligations. And then finally, think about training for both your transport management teams and your engineering functions on not only the changes to the guide, but also your maintenance regime more generally and what that should look like. If you want any specific training, whether it's on the guide to maintaining roadworthiness, the systems and procedures you'd have in place for maintenance, or something more specific like brake testing in particular, then do let us know and we can arrange that for you, or point you in the direction of somebody else that can provide it as well. I'm conscious of time. I do have quite a few questions to go through, and I'll go through those now. I'll work through them, so just bear with me while I pull some of these up. Okay, so somebody's put about, there's some that are quite similar actually, so I'll try and group them. But brake testing temperatures, somebody's asked, when should you take them? Now you've got to take 2 temperatures. So before and after the decelerometer test is what the guide to maintaining roadworthiness is dictating. And record those, and obviously then check them in the way I described to satisfy yourself that there isn't an anomaly and that all the individual readings demonstrate that the brakes are actually working. Somebody's asking about triaxle semi-trailers. Are they still allowed to be tested unladen? Well, they are one of the acceptable reasons for having an unladen roller brake test. They're specifically listed, but do bear in mind there's still that expectation that as a minimum there'll be a quarterly laden roller brake test. Somebody else, just a comment, has said that DVSA have stated they will be enforcing the new guide from April officially, but they've now removed that post. So I can't say that I've seen that myself, that post. But what I would say is actually we are expecting, believe it or not, a further update to the guide to maintaining roadworthiness come April next year, or around about April next year, which we believe may have more significant revisions than the one we've just seen released. So I don't know where that sits with DVSA and enforcement, but I would certainly operate on the basis that the guide has been issued. So that is the guide as it stands today. From today onwards, or from the 5th of November onwards, you will be judged against the guide and what it now says, save for that April 2025 brake testing piece, which obviously will come in from April. Can PMIs be carried out at operating centres without a pit? Example, a mobile mechanic? No, is the short answer. Mobile fitter getting on a crawl board in the yard to get under your vehicle is not, and hasn't for some time, been acceptable. You do need to have proper under vehicle inspection facilities, undercover, pits, lifts, ramps. You need to make sure that those facilities are in place, or you'll fail at the first hurdle when it comes to a DVSA investigation. Few asking about EBPMS and whether, so you can rely on that for PMI, but must do a laden roller brake test at MOT. Yeah, that's what the guide's saying. Couple of people querying the risk assessment and whether it needs to be carried out at every PMI as opposed to, I think, what I said about annually. Well, that depends on whether your vehicle is one that is never going to be laden roller brake tested. If it's a vehicle by design or construction that you have never been laden roller brake testing, you simply need to have the risk assessment available in connection with every PMI. So a risk assessment carried out, for example, now in November, would be good for that vehicle for the following 12 months until it's due for review, unless something changes. Whereas if you've got a vehicle that there are a particular set of circumstances why you are not laden roller brake testing it on that particular 6-weekly inspection, then you would need a risk assessment for that particular safety inspection, because it might be a totally different reason to the last time you didn't laden roller brake test that particular vehicle. Yeah, a couple of you asking about waste vehicles, PSVs. Yes, unladen RCVs, PSVs, unladen is acceptable. Actually, just on that point for PSVs, I think, to be honest, in terms of the changes, there's a lot of perhaps relief for a lot of PSV operators, because fundamentally there's not actually a great deal that's changed for you other than a reminder of your obligations when it comes to the quality control and that maintenance provider piece, the fact that you are accountable. Okay, I think the rest are very much of a similar vein. So I think, conscious of the time, I'll leave it there. I will send, as I said, a certificate and a useful links document to everybody that's joined the session. There's a few of you commented that multiple people had logged on with your link, so I will make sure all those names are captured for the purposes of your certificates. A recording of the session will be available to anybody that's registered. I know we've had many more people register than actually I can see of being on the session. So we'll make sure you all get a copy of the recording of the session. And if you do think of any questions after the session's ended, do feel free to get in touch and we'll do our best to answer those for you. Okay, thank you very much for joining me. Hope you found the last hour or so useful.